So our next reader is Jesse Dukes. You might know him. He's been around town and then not around town, then around town again for many years. He's a contributing editor at the Virginia Quarterly, and he does a lot of radio work for Backstory. And he's a principal at Big Shed, which I don't know much about, but it sounds super cool. He is going to read something tonight. I'm not sure what, but it's going to be amazing. That's one thing I'm sure of. So give it up for Jesse.
I will. It's on my list of all the things I was going to think. But I'll start with that. We have Monolith Studio and Zach Worrell to thank for the log of reading. It's awesome. And if you go to that building over there, there's a whole exhibit of Zach and Monolith's furniture creations. How long will it be up, Zach?
It's going to be up till probably the middle of May.
And when can people stop by?
Tonight, or usually probably on Friday nights, and for sure Friday afternoon, tonight, and then pretty much by appointment during the week. But I'll be like in and out using it, putting stuff in, taking stuff out.
Right on. If you're a writer, you might be able to afford maybe one of the knives that are there, which I'm saving up for. Thank you, Julia and Amy. It's a treat to share this venue with Laura, and it's really neat to be kicking off this series. I have not read fiction aloud for other people. Well, Nell just pointed out that I sort of did once recently, but I have not read fiction aloud for other people for, about 15 years, and I wasn't really very good at it then. So I'm going to stake the next 20 minutes of your life on the proposition that I've gotten better. I might do the radio thing where we drop the script on the floor, drop the pages. All of the lake villages are named for saints. San Judas Tadeo is named after the man they call Saint Jude in English. The priests tell us he is a different man entirely than Judas Iscariot, the betrayer of Christ. But some of the elders say Judas Tadeo and Judas Iscariot are in truth two guises of the same spirit, who the ancients knew as Mazzatatl. Sometimes he appears as a kindly beggar in tattered clothing, who fabulously rewards anybody who takes pity and feeds him. Other times he arrives as a thief in tattered clothing, who robs from anybody who takes pity and feeds him. This confused Manuel when he was a small boy. If he saw an old man in tattered clothes, should he feed him in hopes of reward or chase him off for fear of being robbed? And how could anybody, God or man, be fabulously generous while also deceitful and dangerous? It was only many years later, when he had his own small children, that he began to understand. Manuel's best friend from childhood was Juan, who did not speak. Most called him El Mudo. When Juan was very little, he never minded his parents or aunts and wailed for hours. Eventually, they decided he was deaf and mimed to him with their hands or ignored him. When he was a skinny and indignant 4-year-old, a doctor from the city came and peered into his ears. Juan's parents watched in fascination as the doctor probed with a long stick tipped with something like a tiny spoon. Mumbling in satisfaction, the doctor pulled what looked like a small raisin, shriveled, black, brown, and orange, from Juan's ear. Wax, the doctor said as he probed the other ear. It had blocked the sound, but with the wax removed, Juan would be able to hear. Perhaps it was too late for Juan to learn to talk, or perhaps he could have, but his parents were accustomed to miming, and it felt strange to speak to him. When he was older, Juan seemed to understand spoken language, but if the speaker did not also mime as he talked, Juan ignored him. When he was 6, he started school but soon quit. The teachers made no special efforts with him, and the other students imitated the unconscious keening and whining sounds he made. At home, he had to contend with his father, who drank when he was out of work, and beat Juan when he drank. And so he spent most of his days by the shores of the Great Lake, collecting little shells or trying to scoop out the tiny fish as they approached the rocky banks. The local fishermen taught him parts of their trade in exchange for small, tedious labors like scrubbing boat holes, mending nets, or carrying tackle up the steep hills to the fishermen's houses. When Manuel was old enough, he sometimes wandered to the lake, and if Juan wasn't working, the two tried to spear guppies in the shallows with javelins made from fallen tree limbs. The boys got older. Manuel did well in school, but still went fishing with Juan if he could make time in the afternoons. When he could, he smuggled a few tortillas and beans for Juan, whose parents saved the best portions of food for their other children. By the time they were 14, Juan was quite skinny, but very muscular. He could always find work with one fisherman or another, and not just for his wiry strength. He knew where to find fish, something his employers would not admit, even as they steered the boat where he suggested. He could hold his breath underwater for nearly 3 minutes, and he would dive deep to untangle nets that caught on rocks or twisted in the currents. When they fished together, Manuel sometimes borrowed a spear gun and an old dive mask from his uncle. One late afternoon, they borrowed a boat from an old fisherman who had finished his day's work. As the day grew short, the sun dallied just above the rim of the giant crater that enveloped the entire lake, and the gentle waves reflected the hint of pink in the sky. Juan dove first, swimming in slow, effortless arcs. As Manuel watched his progress from the bobbing boat, he felt slightly queasy. If he watched the horizon, he felt better, but he enjoyed watching Juan's graceful swimming and guessing where he would resurface after each dive. In 15 minutes, Juan had speared a small but edible whitefish and hauled himself aboard the boat. With his hands, he explained there were no more fish in this place, and they should row to another spot, near where the fishermen strung their nets. When Manuel dove, the sun was below the crater rim and the sky darker each minute than the last. Under the lake, Manuel could see 2 meters. He could not swim like Juan, but he could hold his breath for nearly 2 minutes and enjoyed the diffuse light, green-tinged with the sky's bold pink. He dove down 5 meters where he could just see the lake floor and the enormous reed bunches, swaying and billowing like green smoke from a chimney fire. As he hovered above the floor, he saw a reed cat, quite large, swimming slowly up from the mud. He wanted more air, but he knew if he returned to the surface, he would lose sight of the fish, so he had to follow it with his remaining breath. If he was lucky, he would get a clear shot with the spear gun before he neared the surface. He kicked after the reed cat, closing the distance, and felt his breath would hold, but then something dragged across his face, thin and stringy. Assuming it was a tuft of lakeweed, he brushed it aside, but found it resisted his push. A fisherman's net. It had been nearly invisible, just out of the reed cat's path, and right in his. Manuel, needing air, bowed his head and stroked his arms backwards in order to clear the head from the net. As he pushed back, he felt his head draw forward. The net had tangled him, and he felt a pain behind his ears where the cords dug in. He dropped the spear gun and began waving his arms, hoping to clear the net from his head, but only wrapped his arm in a tangle of net. In a panic, he thrashed his arms and head, kicking away while resisting his lungs' demand for breath. The underwater world darkened and spun. Then he felt something solid and smooth against his face. He felt hands clasping his face, pulling off his mask, and a warm force of pressure against his cheek. A mouth, sliding until it found his mouth, and then widening to cover it. He felt dry air forced into his mouth, and he relaxed his lungs, letting them fill with the breath he now understood came from his friend. Then the mouth was gone, and he opened his eyes, but could see nothing in the glooming water without the mask. He began to thrash feebly at the net, already feeling the need for another breath. Then Juan was back and again covered his mouth and forced air into his lungs. He could feel Juan's bony chin digging into his own. Juan began untangling the net. Manuel fought the panic, struggling to relax his arms, to trust his friend. Juan had untangled countless nets and only took a few moments to free him. Then Juan took Manuel's arms and tugged him up towards the lights of the surface. Manuel broke through, gasping and coughing. Juan held him with one arm, swimming to the boat with the other, where he clung to the wooden edge. Juan dove again, returning a minute later with the spear gun. Manuel managed to roll over the side into the bottom of the boat, where he lay dazed and dizzy next to the dying whitefish. Manuel pitied the fish, flopping and gasping weakly, but he made no move to return it to the lake. It was Juan's fish, after all. Will you give me a 2-minute warning when we reach that point? Okay. That year, Juan's mother, always sickly, died from a bad grip. His father, always indolent, stopped working, continued drinking, and soon joined his wife. Juan's brothers and sisters were adopted by their aunts and uncles, and he was taken in by an aunt. She was not affectionate, but she did fix Juan good meals of beans and tortillas. Sometimes she sent him to the market on errands, and he could keep the change from the bills she handed him. One afternoon, flush with coins, he purchased a can of beer. When he was younger, if he saw a can of beer, it was in his father's hands, and he knew he should leave the house. But today he was curious. He loved the beer from the first sip. There was something in the taste that reminded him of the mustiness of the lake. He drank slowly, but it affected him quickly, making him dizzy, lightheaded, and relaxed. He staggered to the lake's edge where he lay down and allowed his muscles to loosen, allowed the dizziness to take him. He closed his eyes and dreamed about the underwater kingdom and its cold and busy citizens. Years later, when Manuel was married with 2 children, he was hired by the mayor to oversee a road crew. The men he worked with were experienced, but Manuel understood how to read the maps drawn by the government architects and engineers. All day long, he argued with the older workers, telling them where the maps demanded they fill potholes, build retaining walls, and cut culverts. The workers always stopped 2 hours before sunset, and if it was a clear and calm day, Manuel eased his frustration with spearfishing. He had a spear gun he had purchased secondhand in the capital. It was white plastic and steel, and with a black rubber band cut from a tire tube that he stretched to arm the spear. Juan did not own a spear gun, but everybody agreed he was the best spear fisherman in San Judas Tadeo. He had grown into a lanky, muscular man, slack-jawed and round-shouldered with loose black hair that fell over his eyes. When he could borrow a spear gun and a snorkel mask, usually from Manuel, he hunted the depths of the lake. The biggest fish hid in the deepest holes, and Juan would tie rocks around his waist and dive as far as 7 meters, hovering just over the holes, approaching from the shady side, and waiting for the big fish to show themselves. He could stay underwater longer than anybody in the village, and he never panicked, even when his lungs screamed for air. When Juan borrowed Manuel's spear gun, he almost always brought back a big whitefish for Manuel's family, even if that meant going home with nothing for himself. The second best fish was for his aunt, and if he had more fish, he sold them at the market. Sometimes he bought clothing or household things for his aunt. When he made a lot of money, he visited the cantina. If he stopped after 1 beer, he could pay and walk home with his fish and purchases. If he had a second beer, he would not stop drinking, not for days. He would spend all the money he had on beer, drinking for hours, and then lie in the street, passed out, drooling. Piss would run down his legs, soaking his pants and draining past his ankles into the cobbles. In San Judas Tadeo, there were net fishermen and there were spear fishermen. Net fishermen took whatever they could catch in their nets, which in recent time meant mostly spotted brimfish. Bland and bony, the brim were disdained by spear fishermen. They considered only 3 fish worthy of their efforts. The first was the big-mouth whitefish, silver-skinned with a rich white meat the women favored in their soups. Whitefish hid during the daytime but came out at sunrise and sunset to hunt insects at the water's surface. They were quick and canny, easy to startle but predictable. Then there were the reed cats who hid in the bottom all day, digging in the mud for worms and grubs. They were fat and strong and could dig with their whiskers. Finally, there were the tigerfish. The tigers were new to the lake, having been brought by a government scientist when Manuel's father was a young man. The man said the tigers would clean the lake, eating the red and green slime that had grown after the mining companies started dumping in the volcano streams. He said tigers would be no good for eating, but they would clean the water and they would make the other fish more abundant. It was true that the tigerfish ate the slime, but they ate everything else they could, including the eggs of the whitefish and the reed cats. Before long, there were more tigerfish than any other. But fortunately, the government man was wrong about the flavor of the tiger. They were every bit as delicious as the whitefish and the reed cat with a rich and slightly greasy meat. Although they were abundant, they were not easy to spear, since they spent most of their time hiding in the cold, deep waters of the lake. From time to time, fishermen would spot a whole school from boats, swimming quickly and purposefully in one direction rather than lingering in the same part of the lake. Unless the fishermen happened to be in just the right spot, they passed by too quickly to be speared. They avoided nets and disdained all bait. It was Juan who figured out how to hunt the tiger. One night, he was hunting alone by a waxing moon in a shallow cove. He was not optimistic about his chances. The water was murky with slime, and there were never many reed cats there. As he swam through the reeds, tree roots, and lake slime, he saw a tiger. Then 2. Then more than a dozen, all swimming slowly around him. They were eating the slime. He remembered he had seen a school swimming in this direction in the afternoon and realized that he had seen a kind of migration from one part of the lake to another. Another fisherman might have speared all the tigers he saw that night, but Juan wanted to learn their secrets. For the next 6 nights, as the moon waxed and began to wane, he returned to the same cove and always found the tigers, slowly eating the cloud of lake slime. By the 6th day, most of the slime was gone, and the tiger school was thinner and more indolent, only feeding for about an hour before disappearing into the depths. The next day, he sat by the cove, and in the late afternoon, he saw the school swimming away, the green and brown striped backs occasionally grazing the water's surface. He was not sure where they were going, but it didn't matter because Juan felt he understood them. From now on, he only needed to watch for the schools in the afternoon, make intelligent guesses about their destinations, and hunt each probable spot until he found the school. After that, Juan often caught up with the schools of tiger, hunting in their midst, taking 4 or 5 large fish in a night. He sometimes took Manuel night hunting for tigers, and the two would take turns diving with Manuel's mask and spear, each walking home with several large fish. Juan gave the money he made from selling fish to Manuel so he could save for his own spear gun and mask. I think we'll leave it at that. It's about half of the story. Thank you very much.